Okay, so today several of my classes left off in generally the same place, but some may be a little off. So I think this is the very beginning of where some classes did not get to, and that is Trumans Actions. So we had just finished talking about McCarthyism. So you can fast forward a little bit if we already talked about this in your class. So because of all of the fear that was coming out of the Red Scare, President Truman was accused of being soft on communists, meaning he wasn't really addressing the issue of communism. So two effects will come from this, and he's going to create two things. One, he's going to create the Loyalty Review Board. And the Loyalty Review Board was used to investigate government employees and dismiss those not loyal to the U.S. government. And it is on the screen. But it's basically the investigation of specifically government employees. The second thing that will be created is the House Un-American Activities Committee, also known as the HUAC. And this group investigated disloyalty inside and outside of the government. So it wasn't specifically towards government positions. That was the Loyalty Review Board, and this is more broad. HUAC is going to do an investigation of the movie and film industry. They think there could be some communist influence present there. And just a side note, why they would investigate the movie industry, you don't have to write this down. During World War II, the film industry produced a lot of pro-Soviet films because we were allied with the Soviet Union. Americans knew the Soviets were communists, and we were afraid of that alliance. And so the film industry was trying to gain American trust in supporting the Soviets since they were helping us during the war. But now that that war's over and we're in the midst of the Cold War, people accused the film industry of spreading Soviet propaganda. So the HUAC is going to attack Hollywood and try to rid them of communist influence. The last Truman response is the McCarran Walter Act. And this is also defined on your screen. But the McCarran Walter Act was a 1952 immigration law that discriminated against potential immigrants from communist-dominated regions. (1952) immigration law that discriminated against potential immigrants from communist-dominated regions. So we were trying to limit immigrants coming in from, of course, the Soviet area, but also those satellite nations in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Albania, etc. And we feel that probably the most disloyal Americans are those coming from the communist-dominated parts of the world, those immigrants. Now, I told you earlier we were concerned about spies in the U.S. So what were two examples of well-known spies, or well-known examples that came out of American or Soviet espionage? And we'll talk about two examples here. We'll first talk about one, Mr. Alger Hiss. That's ALGERHISS. I'm not sure if that's on the outline or not. And Alger Hiss, in 1948, he was accused of passing sensitive information to the Soviet Union. He was accused of passing sensitive information to the Soviet Union. Now, too much time passed between his alleged crime and his trial. So he could not be charged legally for espionage. So instead, he was charged with perjury. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. And he did claim innocence the whole time, but in the 90s it later came out, thanks to the Soviets, that he did seem to appear guilty, at least in some sense. Perhaps the more well-known of the spies were a couple, a married couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, or Rosenberg. And Julius is Julius, and Ethel Ethel, Rosenberg. We know about the atomic bomb that we created in the United States. Well, by 1949, the Soviet Union made their own atomic bomb. And they tested it successfully. So in 1949, the Soviet Union made their own atomic bomb and successfully tested it. This made us nervous. This was sooner than we anticipated that they'd be able to create one. So speculation rose that information was leaked from within the United States. Speculation rose that information was leaked from within the U.S. So our two main suspects are going to be the married couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So the Rosenbergs, they were members of the American Communist Party, and they were accused of leaking information to the Soviets. They claimed they were innocent. But when they were put on trial and put on the stand, they were asked about their involvement with the Communist Party. They both pleaded the Fifth Amendment. They both pleaded the Fifth Amendment. So this is kind of an indirect admission of guilt, because when you plead the Fifth, you are taking the amendment, using the amendment that says you cannot or you don't have to legally say anything that would self-incriminate you. So it's kind of admitting guilt in a sense. Despite any lack of true evidence, though, they were actually convicted and given the death penalty. And they are the first American civilians to be executed for espionage. First American citizens to be executed, first civilian citizens to be executed for espionage. Okay, we will quickly finish our last section tonight. Talking about the Cold War during Eisenhower's administration, because he does become president kind of towards the late 50s. So, the arms race. This was the struggle to gain weapon superiority. The struggle to gain weapon superiority. And there were three parts. And they are on the screen now. First, the growth of nuclear arsenals. Second, Brinksmanship. Brinksmanship, and that's Brinkmanship. And then the third aspect of weapon superiority was the space race. So we'll kind of start with the growth of nuclear arsenals and work our way down. First, the H-bomb. After discovering that the Soviets had successfully built and tested an atomic bomb of their own, Eisenhower orders work to be done on the hydrogen bomb. So after discovering the Soviets had successfully built and tested an atomic bomb of their own, he orders work to be done, meaning he orders the hydrogen bomb to be created. The hydrogen bomb, which is for short H-bomb, would be 67 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. 67 times more powerful. So it's obviously a very, very powerful bomb. We actually test the new H-bomb on Bikini Island. You don't have to know where we did that, but we successfully tested the H-bomb. Many scientists disagreed with creating such a weapon of mass destruction. Many scientists disagreed with creating such a weapon of mass destruction, especially after seeing the atomic bomb's initial destruction. But we will have a working H-bomb. Okay, the next thing are ICBMs, and that stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, but I don't need you to know that. I just want you to know them as ICBMs. ICBMs were missiles that could travel at greater distances than previous weapons. They could hit a pinpointed target with great accuracy. So they are missiles that could travel at greater distances than previous weapons and hit a pinpointed target with great accuracy. So in the 50s, the Soviets announced that they have developed an ICBM. So they are competing with us when it comes to weapons. This leads us to Brinksmanship. And when Eisenhower is president, his Secretary of State is John Foster Dulles, and you don't have to know his name. But I want you to know that under Eisenhower's administration, a new policy was proposed. And that was called Brinksmanship. And in short, so under Eisenhower's administration, a new policy was proposed called Brinksmanship, which meant risking war to protect national interest. Risking war to protect national interest. So what that means is the United States is going to be really being more aggressive in their actions when it comes to creation of weapons, etc. Even though it could mean more tension between them and the Soviet Union, even though it could mean a breakout of war, they wanted to be careful and stick up for American principles and just kind of prepare for the worst. So the U.S. will produce a massive amount of nuclear weapons. But then to counteract that knowledge, or that action, and when they find out, the Soviets are going to also be producing a massive amount of nuclear weapons. So the U.S. was kind of convinced that Soviet weapons were pointed at their cities, and they would build bomb shelters and practice air raids. We'll be watching the duck and cover video tomorrow. Okay, and then lastly, as far as Cold War in the skies, we have Sputnik and the space race. So the Soviets used an ICBM. The Soviets used an ICBM to push the first artificial satellite into space. First artificial satellite into space, and this was called Sputnik. Now, this made Americans feel inferior and vulnerable to any kind of nuclear attack. So Americans, scared that the Soviets would have a nuclear attack on the United States, they feared that the Soviets were catching up with America because they had better science and technology. So I'm sorry, that was wordy. We were afraid that the Soviets had better science and technology to be able to create these weapons. So soon after, we will create something called the National Defense Education Act. National Defense Education Act, where we gave financial aid to schools to improve their math, science, and foreign language education. This gave financial aid to schools to improve their math, science, and foreign language education. So you can tell we are concerned about our abilities in math and science, and so we will be funding those programs a little more fiercely, hoping to catch up to the Soviets in the space race, and soon after we do develop our own artificial satellite. Okay, we'll quickly be going into the U-2 incident and then we're done. So, in the late 50s, the U.S. began making secret flights over Soviet territory. So in the late 1950s, the U.S. began making secret flights over Soviet territory. U-2s, not the band, U-2s, the plane, were used to fly these missions because they could fly very high and they weren't detected on radar. Well, in 1960, U.S. pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down well into Soviet territory. Now, initially the U.S. tried to claim that this was a flight mission to acquire weather information, and it just accidentally went astray. But that's kind of embarrassing because it's obviously a lie. So Eisenhower eventually had to own up and accept responsibility, as it was very obvious what had happened. So this seriously damaged our relations with the Soviet Union, because essentially we were spying on them and admitted it. Okay, we are done with notes, and we're going to continue with our next section tomorrow. Please read over this again, listen over this again if you need to. Try to maybe watch and freeze on the PowerPoint slides. If there's something you couldn't type, I do have some notes on the slides. And write down any questions, and see y'all tomorrow.